AskReddit by Zorby. A child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. What is an example of this that you've seen or experienced firsthand? Does anyone know the actual story of King Shaka Zulu? He was literally that guy. Shaka was born as an illegitimate son of a Zulu, and was thus rejected by the Zulu settlements. He spent his childhood growing up in his mother's settlements and was then lent an army, which he used to take over the Zulu tribe. One of the greatest, but most intense, African warriors and monarchs of all time. Not only does Shaka Zulu burn the whole village, but also my capital by turn 50. Deleted. It takes many acts of hatred to break a child's spirit. With one act of kindness, you saved it. Thanks man. You did good. I knew a girl a few years back who I think is a decent example of this. She was diagnosed with AD back in primary school and was shunned by her whole family because of it. As a result, she had low self-esteem and slowly grew a profound hatred for people, which resulted in everyone at school hating her, and as a result her hatred grew more. After her 17th birthday she ran away, but before she did she had spent about 5 years gathering dirt on everyone who wronged her. She released it all, which resulted in her parents splitting and a bunch of other kids being expelled or getting into shit with their parents, and if memory serves me correctly, one kid even got disowned because of what everyone found out about him. She ended up running up to a family friends of mine and is still working on rebuilding her life. It's a shame because she is one of the nicest people I know and is very honest person. Talk about going in style. IDK if this is the right interpretation, but it is quite literal. I had a friend in elementary school who was neglected by his mom and beat by his dad. One day at school he told me he was going to get revenge, and I didn't really think of it. The next morning on the news we saw a report on a child who had caused a gas explosion by pouring gas on his parents while they were sleeping and throwing a match on them. He lost his right leg and had burns all over his lower body, and he killed both of his parents. He never went back to public school until the 6th grade when he finally showed up. I asked him where he'd been and he said the hospital, and then juvenile detention. TLDR, child gets abused so he blows up his parents. You got an interesting friend there. I once attended a birthday party with a bouncy castle. The birthday kid and their friends kicked the younger sibling and his friend out, so then plugged it and watched everyone's dismay as it deflated. Way to go, Mason. Badass moves for a 12-year-old. Good lord, if Mason is 12, what kind of older siblings teenagers are renting a birthday bouncy castle? Is that the cool thing these days with the local youths? I'm a behavioral interventionist at a middle school. My job is technically to pull disruptive students out of class, get them redirected, then back into their classroom. Most of my job is actually a sounding board and an understanding ear to kids who struggle. My entire job is an example of that quote. The neglect and abuse of some of those kids will break your heart. So much respect for this role. All the very best with it. I don't know if it 100% fits, but I will share anyway. There's this one kid I went to high school with. He was incredibly sheltered by his parents to the point where he couldn't even leave his driveway or even watch most shows on the Disney Channel. All of a sudden his parents have a change of heart and give him a lot more freedom. Well, he gets involved with the wrong people online and ends up a neo-Nazi. Let this be a lesson in why you shouldn't shelter your kids. Well, that escalated quickly. My old workplace had some serious workplace safety issues and serious HR issues. No matter who I notified, be it OSHA or likewise, nothing ever happened. So I quit, and being the head of it I knew that would cause problems. Not only did I quit, but I convinced the customer relations director, and a few other higher ups to do the same. Completely toppled the company and they lost $275,000 of their usual annual $290,000. Since then all of the issues have been fixed. What year was this? That annual revenue is barely enough to cover a handful of people, not even including other business costs. Wife joined a therapy office that had existed for 4 years. She worked for 2 years doing basically everything. Think payroll and a lot of paperwork that ended up taking over 10 to 15 hours weekly that she didn't get paid for. She had been made equal partner after 1 year. She was never appreciated this whole time. After several final straws, she started her own office with 2 others and ran the other asshole out of town in 6 months. 2 years and she now makes more money with half the work. Deleted. I feel this in my bones. I have a similar story. I am a professional musician and had to leave the largest band I was in because of the deterioration of the lead singer. Lost his mind at some point and has become an egomaniac delusional that destroys just about everything he touches, all while making everyone resent him. Now has the nerve to play the victim at every opportunity. It's something else to see firsthand. From your clues, I also have an idea of who you might be, and if I'm right, I may be way wrong. Big fan of yours. Deleted. The way you wrote it at the end, the only story here to nearly make me cry. Deleted. I was in basically the same situation except the constant expectations from my parents were a problem for me. I ended up dealing with depression, but I still always tried to behave like a responsible adult and care for and believe in my autistic little brother in a way that my parents never quite did for me. He ended up having really good grades and a successful job and a remarkable air of competency that I never truly had, and by the time he graduated high school he was the responsible one with a solid future and I was the screw up. He once told me that even if I was a bit useless, I was more of a father to him than our actual dad ever was, and I couldn't be more proud of him. I was abused, and to this day the majority of my family doesn't acknowledge it, but I never felt safe or protected, so I lashed out a lot. Actually, I was just standing up for myself and calling out the bullshit in our family, but nobody wanted to hear me, so it was lashing out because I never just shut up. I apparently tore the family apart, and now my dad lives in another state, but my parents are still together and our family is a mess. Apparently when you're in a dysfunctional family you're just supposed to sweep it under the rug and take what's coming to you equals. A distant relative of mine took this a bit too literally in a sense. Her mother was a perfectionist and the father couldn't take it. She would insist on letting the babies cry it out and was overall incredibly set in her ways. He left but wanted to stay in the children's lives. However, the mother used this as an opportunity to get as much money and hurt him as much as possible. Obtaining any kind of custody became too much, so the father left. This all happened while his children were fairly young. The son was known as a troubled kid and crazy. The mother hated him for it, so she sent him to a military school. This would later save his life. Once he was out of the picture, the daughter became the center of all of her mother's tendencies. She was quiet but never lived up to her expectations. Without a solid support system, she began to act out as well. It culminated with her setting the house on fire and being sent to juvie for the rest of her high school days. She graduated there and her mother didn't even bother to show up. One of my best friends in high school had a few really crappy boyfriends. She is very bright, excelled on the debate team, and is really attractive, but her mom was a serious alcoholic and was always getting into new relationships and then breaking up, which I think passed some attachment issues onto my friend. When we were seniors, she was talking about all the losers she'd dated, been mistreated by, and how none of them were going anywhere in life. She said something to the effect of, "I'd love to be there when they inevitably get locked up for drugs or domestic abuse, or both." She got a law degree, moved back to our town, and is now the county prosecutor. Hot damn. I'm half laughing and half in awe. I can't help but think this would make an excellent premise for a TV series. Teacher at the school I grew up at, the type of teacher that loves to toss worksheets at kids, ended up in charge of the shop program. She ended up getting the funds for a CNC plasma table, plus a training on its function, maintenance, operation, programs, etc. She didn't attend the training, but instead had one of her students that was fairly bright do it all with the assumption he would just disseminate the information to the other kids because he was so passionate about the project. A couple months in, and, Being the gossip small town rumor mill type person, she starts bad mouthing and spreading rumors about the kid. As they got to know each other better, they apparently gained a distance for one another. Because this is a charter school and the kid had transferred from a public school, he just told his parents he'd rather be back in public high school again. He quickly exited with Al. I am burning down my community right now. That is, my neighbors are fucking with me, trying to weaponize the bylaws of our HOA to construct a spiteful road on my property for their driveway. Fire safety they call it. $25,000 in unnecessary legal expenses, I call it. So I let my HOA know that if they allow this, don't stand up forcefully for me in court, then I will use that same power to demand a 60 road down the entire HOA, literally forcing neighbors I don't know to move their homes. I am being treated poorly, feel unwelcome in my new village, so I am enforcing my rights and burning down the neighborhood. It will cost 25 landowners $1 million to make up for fucking with me. Some may literally lose their homes, and afterwards their property values will be much lower. But I told them what would happen if they did not support me, gave them a chance. How would that work exactly? How could you enforce, or they enforce a new road? That's crazy. I don't understand how any of that works. Neglectful childhood and abusive parent. I am putting that woman in a home as soon as she's old enough and torching her house after I get a burn permit. Over 10-year plan in the making. The bitterness is real. A trucking company I used to work for treated me like I wasn't even human. I was working 70 hours a week and making just barely more than I did in 40 hours as a dishwasher. They constantly threatened to fire me for refusing to drive in one dangerous situation or another. They ignored small problems on my truck until the problem left me stuck on the side of the road, then they blamed me for not reporting the problem. It was common for them to give me 8 hours to go 500 miles in a truck that's limited to 63 miles per hour, then blame me for missing the delivery appointment. I noped out when news broke about this company committing huge amounts of stock fraud, and now the company doesn't exist anymore. I still occasionally see repo companies posting rewards for their trucks and trailers, or fenced-in lots full of them, and it feels pretty satisfying. I feel bad for the 3,000 truckers they abandoned, but not for the office staff who took every chance they could to screw me over. Sell it on A? Didn't see this firsthand, but I used to know this guy who was a refugee due to being from a war zone in his home country. He burned down a bunch of tents in his refugee camp after all the trauma he went through and stress he felt from being there. Poor guy was such a troubled kid and is now a troubled man. A lot of people who were raised by narcissists or suffered child abuse who can't heal afterwards. Abuse from an arc is like an onion. There are so many layers of emotions you go through as you realize all the ways your parents went out of their way to stunt or step on you. And because they're narcs, you'll never get closure from them. There was this one uproar revenge story I read where Op's mom was raped and gave birth to Op. OP got bullied by everyone and their grandma cause he was an unholy child. He grew up to be someone that inspected towns or something I don't remember. So he was assigned to his hometown and their town was pretty bad, but since Op grew up in this town, they'd get a free pass. OP left a bad review or something and ruined the whole town financially, and as expected, he was very satisfied. IDK if this counts as experienced, but oh well. Fuck, beat me to it. I was think about this post too. He ruined the town financially because its whole economy was built on the one factory in town. You either left or worked at the factory, and OP just shut the shit down even when the town tried to suck his cock on his return. This is probably going to get lost, but I work with emotionally disturbed kids, so see this a lot. Very rarely do kids end up emotionally fucked up without some level of family trauma. To take it quite literally, taught a kid who was a victim of domestic violence. Burned down the house, with the family inside. Luckily they all got out, but dad suffered some pretty horrific burns. Taught a kid who had severe family trauma, but was replaced with mum eventually, after mum had got clean and started a new family. One time, In the middle of the night, he went downstairs, poured olive oil all over the tiles, at the base of the stairs, then started yelling help. Mum came running down the stairs, slipped in the oil, and broke her arm. Lucky it wasn't a neck. After several more pretty horrific acts of violence, he had to be moved out of the home. Honestly, have dozens of these stories, of kids who have lashed out on their abusive families. Ever watch Avatar? I got this statement from Azula, especially understanding the unspoken elements of her story and what made the character the way she was. I think this actually fits for both Zuko and Azula, though more for Zuko. Ozai never accepted him as a child and mistreated him for years. Eventually, his father pushed him far enough that he aligned himself with Ozai's greatest enemy, and Zuko quite literally burnt down his family's legacy in the war. Azula, on the other hand, was looked down upon by her mother, as if she was a monster. So she became what her mother saw her as and sought to destroy anything she ever cared about, and eventually tried to kill her, but hey. You could apply this to many minority groups that become insurgencies. This reminds me of another quote by JFK, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." No one wanted me, so I burned all bridges and joined the army at 17. I no longer crave affection from those who don't care for me. But most importantly, I made my own family full of love and warmth. I'm married and my dad hates it and has never spoken to my husband. My dad disapproves of my cats. The village was cold, so I left it and made my own village radiating with warmth and love. Any number of multiple murderers, arsonists, suicide bombers, etc. As a society, we're just in love with abandonment, so we abandon our most vulnerable every chance we get. Instead of providing an environment in which everyone can flourish, we focus on degrading and reducing each other so that we can lie to ourselves that we are the best because we're least shitty. It doesn't stop us from being shitty or from turning the world to shit. There's an African tribe called the Maasai who acknowledge each other by asking, "And how are the children?" and the response would be, "All the children are well." My wife works in a non-profit whose goal is to create trauma-informed communities. It's based in St. Louis and the majority of the work is done in schools. Many schools in the region have come to use the Maasai example as a way to explain trauma in our young children. Can we confidently say our children are well? That they are safe and protected and nurtured? How can we view the behavior of children who we know are not well through this lens of trauma? Now that we know they aren't well, does their misbehavior make more sense? Once we do that, how do we heal our children and our communities? It's difficult work. Deleted. Optimistic nihilism. Start with, nothing matters. Then, if nothing matters, I get to decide what matters. If the universe has no purpose, I get to dictate what its purpose is. And finally, arrive at, if we only get one shot at life, I might as well do what makes me happy, as long as I don't deny others this freedom. Just sagged, fixed spelling, thanks. Any school shooting tragedy? Have not heard the quote before. Very appropriate. I work in education. You just see it and it's so sad. The opposite of that, what a child can become when they are embraced. Look at the Irwin children. You can tell that when Steve died, Terry was able to really turn that loss into positive energy towards her children. Not to say that Steve dying was a good thing, of course, but she is obviously a strong person. My mother and stepfather pretty much ignored me and focused on my little brother. I'd ended up doing shit deliberately so they'd have to pay attention to me, from shoplifting to just taking things around the house, from money to just food. Eventually I walked out and haven't spoken to them in years, as years of being ignored, to them making excuses so they didn't have to see my school plays, to going to my parents' evenings, but dropping everything for my younger brothers just got to be too much. A child not getting affection is behaving bad to get attention at least. Colin Kaepernick. He is from the same town I live in. He is the same age as my son. Has been vilified and disowned by a large percent of the city. He is set to film a biopic of his experience growing up here and the racial issues he dealt with. Potentially both a burnt village and embarrassing portrayal of residents.